Picture the disciplined warrior, cape snapping in the wind, hammer raised, jaw set, every blow controlled. This is the Thor most people carry in their heads, built by Marvel starting in 1962, sharpened by Kenneth Branagh's film in 2011, polished further across a decade of sequels, composed, in command of himself. The oldest surviving account of Thor losing his hammer tells a different story. Giants steal it. To get it back, Thor puts on a wedding dress. The poem is called Thrimskvida, the Lay of Thrym. It survives in one manuscript, the Codex Regius, copied in Iceland around 1270. In it, a giant named Thrymer steals Mjolnir and buries it 8 miles under the earth. His price for returning it is Freya's hand in marriage. The gods refuse to hand her over. Instead, they dress Thor in jewels, women's clothing to the knee, a bridal headdress, and Freya's own necklace, Brisingamen, and send him to the wedding disguised as the bride he is not. There is no duel for the hammer. There is a costume, and a role Thor has to hold to stay alive. At the feast, he nearly gives himself away twice. He eats an entire ox, 8 salmon, and every sweet cake laid out for the women, then drinks 3 full casks of mead. One giant at the table leans toward the bride, and says he never saw one with so wide a bite, nor a maiden who drank so deep. Loki, seated beside him disguised as the bridesmaid, has to invent an excuse on the spot. The hammer only returns to Thor's hands because custom calls for it to be laid in the bride's lap to bless the marriage. Thor grabs it the moment it touches him and kills every giant in the hall. That is the account. Not a summary, not an interpretation. A god who gets his weapon back by sitting through his own wedding in a dress, eating like it, and waiting for the ritual to hand it to him. The text that preserves this sits in a manuscript almost 800 years old. Where it came from before that, no one can say with certainty. Some scholars read it as one of the oldest poems in the whole collection, heathen through and through. Others read it as a later, half-mocking retelling written after Iceland had already turned Christian. The record does not settle which. What is clear is that Snorri, writing his own account of the gods a generation before this poem was copied down, never repeats this particular story. It survives in this one manuscript alone, uncorroborated by any other medieval source. Parts of it kept resurfacing anyway, turning up in Scandinavian folk songs recorded as late as the 1800s, centuries after any monk had reason to write them down as parody. What the poem itself says happened does not look like the version on a modern movie poster. This poem is not an isolated joke, sitting alone in the record. It belongs to a pair of source collections scholars treat as the backbone of Norse mythology. The Poetic Edda is a set of anonymous verses, their composition dated anywhere from the 9th to the 12th century, gathered into the Codex Regius manuscript in the 1270s. The prose Edda was written separately by a named author, the Icelandic chieftain Snorri Sturluson, around 1220. Both were compiled by Christian Icelanders centuries after the country's conversion. Snorri even frames the gods in his own prologue as ancient human kings later mistaken for divinities, a Christian scholar's attempt to make pagan material safe to write down at all. Snorri's version of Thor gives the bride's story no mention, but it gives another humiliation in full, one that can be checked against nothing else, because it stands alone in his own book. The journey to the castle of a giant king named Utgarda-loki. Thor arrives expecting to prove his strength. He is offered 3 contests. First, drink from a horn until it empties. Thor drinks 3 times with everything he has, and the level barely drops. Second, lift a grey cat off the floor. Thor strains until his back arches and only manages to raise 1 paw. Third, wrestle an old woman named Ellie. The harder Thor fights her, the weaker his footing gets, until he is forced down onto 1 knee. Thor loses all 3. Then Utgarda-loki explains why, and vanishes with his castle before Thor can retaliate. The horn was secretly connected to the sea itself, and Thor's 3 swallows are the reason the tides now rise and fall. The cat was the World Serpent in disguise, coiled around the whole earth, and lifting 1 paw off the ground was, in truth, an almost impossible feat. Ellie was old age itself, and no one, the giant says, has ever beaten her, or ever will. The trick reframes the loss as something close to triumph. But the contests themselves, on their own terms, are 3 defeats in a row, and Thor does not walk away from Utgard, having won a single one honestly. The pattern holds in a 3rd account, one preserved back in the Poetic Edda, rather than Snorri's book. Hymiskvida, the Lay of Hymer. Here Thor goes looking for a cauldron large enough to brew ale for all the gods, and the only one big enough belongs to a giant named Hymir, father of the god Tyr. At the welcoming meal, 3 oxen are slaughtered for the table. Thor eats 2 of them by himself. Hymir watches this happen and says out loud that he will need to hunt for his own food tomorrow if the guest keeps eating at that rate. The next day, the 2 of them go out fishing. Hymir wants bait. Thor solves the problem by walking over to the giant's own herd and ripping the head clean off his best ox, then using it to bait the hook. They row out past where Hymir usually stops, and Thor keeps rowing further still. What takes the bait is the Midgard serpent itself, Jörmungandr, the creature that circles the whole world underwater. Thor hauls it up toward the surface, close enough to strike it, and Hymir panics. He cuts the line at the side of the boat to let the serpent sink back down, and Thor, furious at losing the kill, slams his feet straight through the floor of the boat. He does not land the serpent. He wrecks his own ride home doing it. 3 separate episodes, 3 different sources, 1 from Snorri's book, 2 from the anonymous poetic collection. In every one, Thor is stopped short of the clean victory the modern version assumes he always gets. He gets his hammer back through a disguise, not a duel. He loses every contest at Utgard outright. He hooks the serpent and never lands it, and takes his frustration out on the boat. None of this required Thor to be gentle. In a 4th text, Lokasenna, the flighting of Loki, Thor is anything but restrained. At a feast where Loki has spent the whole poem insulting every other god in turn, Thor arrives late and threatens him outright 4 separate times with the exact same words each time. That his hammer will close Loki's mouth and break every bone in his body if he does not stop talking. Loki backs down, but only in front of Thor specifically, and even then he gets in one last jab, reminding him of the time he cowered inside a giant's glove, mistaking it for a haul. Thor does not deny it. None of these 4 accounts agrees to sand him down. He is coarse, food-driven, quick to threaten murder, and beaten more often than he wins outright. And every one of these details comes from the same 2 collections modern adaptations claim to be drawing from. That does not make the disciplined, composed Thor a total invention. Snorri's own book contains other episodes where Thor kills giants efficiently and without embarrassment, and God of War's own marketing, in reaching for a grayer, coarser design, was drawing on exactly this material to correct exactly this image. The corrective is not new. It is just as old as the poems. What the record actually supports is narrower and stranger than either version alone. Not a disciplined warrior, not a simple monster. A god who eats too much, loses more than the movies let him, and still keeps the hammer, because losing in these 4 poems was never the same as being destroyed.